Coldness and Cruelty. Deleuze. Chapter 1. The language of Sada and Mazoch. It is too idealistic and therefore cruel. Dostoevsky, the insulted and injured. What are the uses of literature? The names of Sada and Mazoch have been used to denote two basic perversions, and as such they are outstanding examples of the efficiency of literature. Illnesses are sometimes named after typical patients, but more often it is the doctor's name that is given to the disease, Rogers disease, Parkinson's disease, etc. The principles behind this labeling deserve closer analysis. The doctor does not invent the illness, he dissociates symptoms that were previously grouped together, and links up others that were dissociated. In short, he builds up a profoundly original clinical picture. The history of medicine can therefore be regarded under at least two aspects. The first is the history of illnesses, which may disappear, become less frequent, reappear or alter their form according to the state of the society and the development of therapeutic methods. Intertwined with this history is the history of symptomatology, which sometimes precedes and sometimes follows changes in therapy or in the nature of diseases. Symptoms are named, renamed and regrouped in various ways. Progress from this point of view generally means a tendency toward greater specificity, and indicates a refinement of symptomatology. Thus the plague and leprosy were more common in the past not only for historical and social reasons but because one tended to group under these headings various types of diseases now classified separately. Great clinicians are the greatest doctors. When a doctor gives his name to an illness, this is a major linguistic and semiological step, inasmuch as a proper name is linked to a given group of signs, that is, a proper name is made to connote signs. Should we therefore class Sada and Mazoch among the great clinicians? It is difficult to treat sadism and masochism on a level with the plague, leprosy and Parkinson's disease. The word disease is clearly inappropriate. Nevertheless, Sada and Mazoch present unparalleled configurations of symptoms and signs. In coining the term masochism, Kraft-Hebing was giving Mazoch credit for having redefined a clinical entity not merely in terms of the link between pain and sexual pleasure, but in terms of something more fundamental connected with bondage and humiliation. There are limiting cases of masochism without algolagnia and even algolagnia without masochism. Point 1. Another question we should ask is whether Mazoch does not present a symptomatology that is more refined than Sada's in that it enables us to discriminate between disturbances which were previously regarded as identical. In any case, whether Sada and Mazoch are patients or clinicians or both, they are also great anthropologists, of the type whose work succeeds in embracing a whole conception of man, culture, and nature. They are also great artists in that they discovered new forms of expression, new ways of thinking and feeling, and an entirely original language. In principle, violence is something that does not speak, or speaks but little, while sexuality is something that is little spoken about. Sexual modesty cannot be related to biological fear, otherwise it would not be formulated as it is. I am less afraid of being touched and even of being seen than of being put into words. What is the meaning of the meeting of violence and sexuality in such excessive and abundant language as that of Sada and Mazoch? How are we to account for the violent language linked with eroticism? In a text that ought to invalidate all theories relating Sada to Nazism, Georges Vitali explains that the language of Sada is paradoxical because it is essentially that of a victim. Only the victim can describe torture. The torturer necessarily uses the hypocritical language of established order and power. As a general rule, the torturer does not use the language of the violence exerted by him in the name of an established authority. He uses the language of the authority. The violent man is willing to keep quiet and connives at cheating. Thus Sada's attitude is diametrically opposed to that of the torturer. When Sada writes he refuses to cheat, but he attributes his own attitude to people who in real life could only have been silent and uses them to make self-contradictory statements to other people too. Ought we to conclude that the language of Mazoch is equally paradoxical in this instance because the victim speaks the language of the torturer he is to himself, with all the hypocrisy of the torturer? What is known as pornographic literature is a literature reduced to a few imperatives: do this, do that, followed by obscene descriptions. Violence and eroticism do meet, but in a rudimentary fashion. Imperatives abound in the work of Sada and Mazoch. They are issued by the cruel libertine or by despotic woman. Descriptions also abound, although the function of the descriptions as well as the nature of their obscenity are strikingly different in the two authors. It would appear that both for Sada and for Mazoch language reaches its full significance when it acts directly on the senses. Sada's The 120 Days of Sodom hinges on tales told to the libertines by women chroniclers, and in principle the heroes may not take any initiative in anticipation of these tales. Words are at their most powerful when they compel the body to repeat the movements they suggest, and the sensations communicated by the ear are the most enjoyable and have the keenest impact. In Mazoch is life as well. As in his fiction, love affairs are always set in motion by anonymous letters, by the use of pseudonyms or by advertisements in newspapers. They must be regulated by contracts that formalize and verbalize the behavior of the partners. Everything must be stated, promised, announced, and carefully described before being accomplished. However, the work of Sada and Mazoch cannot be regarded as pornography. It merits the more exalted title of pornology because its erotic language cannot be reduced to the elementary functions of ordering and describing. With Sada we witness an astonishing development of the demonstrative use of language. Demonstration as a higher function of language makes its appearance between sequences of description, while the libertines are resting, or in the interval between two commands. One of the libertines will read out a severe pamphlet, or expound inexhaustible theories, or draft a constitution. Alternatively, he may agree to hold a conversation or a discussion with his victim. Such moments are frequent, particularly in Justine, where each of the heroine's torturers uses her as a listener and confidant. The libertine may put on an act of trying to convince and persuade. He may even proselytize and gain new recruits, as in philosophy in the bedroom. But the intention to convince is merely apparent, for nothing is in fact more alien to the sadist than the wish to convince, to persuade, in short to educate. He is interested in something quite different, namely to demonstrate that reasoning itself is a form of violence, and that he is on the side of violence, however calm and logical he may be. He is not even attempting to prove anything to anyone, but to perform a demonstration related essentially to the solitude and omnipotence of its author. The point of the exercise is to show that the demonstration is identical to violence. It follows that the reasoning does not have to be shared by the person to whom it is addressed any more than pleasure is meant to be shared by the object from which it is derived. The acts of violence inflicted on the victims are a mere reflection of a higher form of violence to which the demonstration testifies. Whether he is among his accomplices or among his victims, each libertine, while engaged in reasoning, is caught in the hermetic circle of his own solitude and uniqueness, even if the argumentation is the same for all the libertines. In every respect, as we shall see, the sadistic instructor stands in contrast to the masochistic educator. Here, again, Vitali says of Sada, it is a language which repudiates any relationship between speaker and audience. Now if it is true that this language is the supreme realization of a demonstrative function to be found in the relation between violence and eroticism, then the other aspect, the language of imperatives and descriptions, appears in a new light. It still remains, but in an entirely dependent role, steeped in the demonstrative element, as it were, floating in it. The descriptions, the attitudes of the bodies, are merely living diagrams illustrating the abominable descriptions. Similarly, the imperatives uttered by the libertines are like the statements of problems referring back to the more fundamental chain of sadistic theorems. I have demonstrated it theoretically, says Marsuil, let us now put it to the test of practice. We have therefore to distinguish two factors constituting a dual language. The first, the imperative and descriptive factor, represents the personal element. It directs and describes the personal violence of the sadist as well as his individual tastes. The second and higher factor represents the impersonal element in sadism and identifies the impersonal violence with an idea of pure reason, with a terrifying demonstration capable of subordinating the first element. In Sada we discover a surprising affinity with Spinoza, a naturalistic and mechanistic approach imbued with the mathematical spirit. This accounts for the endless repetitions, the reiterated quantitative process of multiplying illustrations and adding victim upon victim, again and again retracing the thousand circles of an irreducibly solitary argument. Krafft-Ebing sensed the essential nature of such a process. In certain cases the personal element is almost entirely absent. The subject gets sexual enjoyment from beating boys and girls, but the purely impersonal element of its perversion is much more in evidence. While in most individuals of this type the feelings of power are experienced in relation to specific persons, we are dealing here with a pronounced form of sadism operating to a great extent in geographical and mathematical patterns. 3. In the work of Mazuk there is a similar transcendence of the imperative and the descriptive toward a higher function. But in this case it is all persuasion and education. We are no longer in the presence of a torturer seizing upon a victim and enjoying her all the more because she is unconsenting and unpersuaded. We are dealing instead with a victim in search of a torturer and who needs to educate, persuade, and conclude an alliance with the torturer in order to realize the strangest of schemes. This is why advertisements are part of the language of masochism while they have no place in true sadism, and why the masochist draws up contracts while the sadist abominates and destroys them. The sadist is in need of institutions, the masochist of contractual relations. The Middle Ages distinguished with considerable insight between two types of commerce with the devil. The first resulted from possession, the second from a pact of alliance. The sadist thinks in terms of institutionalized possession, the masochist in terms of contracted alliance. Possession is the sadist's particular form of madness just as the pact is the masochist's. It is essential to the masochist that he should fashion the woman into a despot, that he should persuade her to cooperate and get her to sign. He is essentially an educator and thus runs the risk inherent in educational undertakings. In all masochist novels, the woman, although persuaded, is still basically doubting, as though she were afraid. She is forced to commit herself to a role to which she may prove inadequate, either by overplaying or by falling short of expectations. In The Divorced Woman, the heroine complains, Julian's ideal was a cruel woman, a woman like Catherine the Great, but alas, I was cowardly and weak. In Venus, Wanda says, I am afraid of not being capable of it, but for you, my beloved, I am willing to try. Or again, beware, I might grow to enjoy it. The educational undertaking of masochist heroes, their submission to a woman, the torments they undergo, are so many steps in their climb toward the ideal. The Divorced Woman is subtitled The Calvary of an Idealist. Severin, the hero of Venus, takes as a motto for his doctrine of supersensualism the words of Mephistopheles to Faust, Thou sensual, supersensual libertine, a little girl can lead thee by the nose. Übersinnlich in Goethe's text does not mean supersensitive but supersensual, supercarnal, in conformity with theological tradition, where Sinnlichkeit denotes the flesh, sensualitas. It is therefore not surprising that masochism should seek historical and cultural confirmation in mystical or idealistic initiation rites. The naked body of a woman can only be contemplated in a mystical frame of mind, as is the case in Venus. This fact is illustrated more clearly still in The Divorced Woman, where the hero, Julian, under the disturbing influence of a friend, desires for the first time to see his mistress naked. He begins by invoking a need to observe, but finds that he is overcome by religious feeling without anything sensual about it. We have here the two basic stages of fetishism. The ascent from the human body to the work of art and from the work of art to the idea must take place under the shadow of the whip. Mazuk is animated by a dialectical spirit. In Venus the story is set in motion by a dream that occurs during an interrupted reading of Hegel. But the primary influence is that of Plato. While Sada is Spinozistic and employs demonstrative reason, Mazuk is Platonic and proceeds by dialectical imagination. One of Mazuk's stories is entitled The Love of Plato and was at the origin of his adventure with Ludwig II. Mazuk's relation to Plato is evidenced not only by the ascent to the realm of the intelligible, but by the whole technique of dialectical reversal, disguise and reduplication. In the adventure with Ludwig II Mazuk does not know at first whether his correspondent is a man or a woman. He is not sure at the end whether he is one or two people, nor does he know during the episode what part his wife will play, but he is prepared for anything, a true dialectician who knows the opportune moment and seizes it. Plato showed that Socrates appeared to be the lover but that fundamentally he was the loved one. Likewise the masochistic hero appears to be educated and fashioned by the authoritarian woman whereas basically it is he who forms her, dresses her for the part and prompts the harsh words she addresses to him. It is the victim who speaks through the mouth of his torturer, without sparing himself. Dialectic does not simply mean the free interchange of discourse, but implies transpositions or displacements of this kind, resulting in a scene being enacted simultaneously on several levels with reversals and reduplications in the allocation of roles and discourse. Pornological literature is aimed above all at confronting language with its own limits, with what is in a sense a non-language, violence that does not speak, eroticism that remains unspoken. However, this task can only be accomplished by an internal splitting of language. The imperative and descriptive function must transcend itself toward a higher function, the personal element turning by reflection upon itself into the impersonal. When Sada invokes a universal analytical reason to explain that which is most particular in desire, we must not merely take this as evidence that he is a man of the 18th century. Particularity and the corresponding delusion must also represent an idea of pure reason. Similarly, when Mazuk invokes the dialectical spirit, the spirit of Mephistopheles and that of Plato in one, this must not merely be taken as proof of his romanticism. Here too particularity is seen reflectively in the impersonal ideal of the dialectical spirit. In Sada the imperative and descriptive function of language transcends itself toward a pure demonstrative, instituting function, and in Mazuk toward a dialectical, mythical, and persuasive function. These two transcendent functions essentially characterize the two perversions. They are twin ways in which the monstrous exhibits itself in reflection.